Good morning, class. Please be seated. The flagship incident and the opening up of trade, as well as the eventual implications of the end of the Tokugawa isolation, which resulted in the fall of the Bakufu and its replacement by the Meiji government, which adopted many similar policies to the final days of the Tokugawa Bakufu, including the idea that Japan needed to open up for not simply Western trade, but for Western ideas. Today, we're going to discuss the history of the often not mentioned, but very important group nonetheless, within the higher ranks of Japanese society up until the end of the Bakufu. This is going to be regarding the Onna-Bugeisha or the Onna-Bugeisha. The terms are not the exact same, but they're relatively similar enough that they can be used interchangeably. Onna-Bugeisha, the term I tend towards using, simply translates to female martial artist. So this can be anything from what you would think of as a female samurai to someone who is a woman that teaches the use of the naginata or the bow or the kusarigama or whatever weapon, even hand-to-hand combat, would fall under the purview of the term Onna-Bugeisha. Whereas the term Onna-Musha, which is one I have found that others tend towards using, is literally female warrior. Again, the two are not the exact same, but interchangeable enough that one can be used over the other. Now, this group goes all the way back to the, oh goodness, the Empress, her name is, oh yes. Hold on, just a moment. Jingū, that's it, I completely forgot her name. Empress Jingū. And culminates in the woman we discussed, or one of the two, rather not one of, but the two women we discussed that were in the Genpei War. Or, sorry, not the Genpei War, the Boshin War. Ucheko Nankano and her Jōshitai. But let us start all the way back with Empress Jingū. There's not a lot that is known about Empress Jingū, mostly because it is, well, legend. We know that after the death of her husband, she was given, well, again, this is legend, so we should preface that as such. But it is said that after her husband died, she was given a divine mandate and was told, invade Korea. You will find throughout most of our history in Japan, we like to invade Korea a lot. A lot of that stems from the fact that Japan is not terribly rich in resources of its own. the resources of Japan are limited. There is some iron sand which can be used to make metals. There are a lot of trees, so lumber is very easily acquired, but as more, hmm, not even industrialization, but as more technological advances become widespread, you find that the resources of Japan are not capable of maintaining these advances. So we tend towards invading Korea because we like Korean stuff and we want to have it. But other than Empress Jingū being given this mandate to attack Korea and invade and take it over, she is said to have been doing this while pregnant with the future emperor, Fuji. She has become a symbol of not just martial strength, but national strength, not just for the people of Japan, but especially for Japanese women to show, look, you as a woman in Japan, this can be you. You can, with the determination, with that drive, become someone who leads our nation to greatness. With the, again, Onna-Bugeisha is the term we will use throughout the lesson, but Onna-Bugeisha also fits. The Onna-Bugeisha were rather part of what is referred to as the bushi class, or samurai class. The proper name of the class is bushi, which is the warrior class. Samurai means one that serves, and honestly is not a term that was generally used for the most part. That was the thing that came later. Now, in most feudal societies, and in most societies in general, women were typically not given much in the way of any sort of martial training. It was felt that women belonged predominantly in the home, caring for children, raising the future, whatever they may be. But for women of bushi families, it was not uncommon to have some martial training. The bow is, for those that are unaware, the traditional weapon of the samurai or the bushi. Bushi started out, and again, throughout this lesson, we will generally default towards the word samurai. We may use the term bushi, but the two are the same thing. But the proto samurai, the proto bushi, were originally horseback archers, not very dissimilar from the steppe archers of Mongolia. The primary difference was the bow that was used, whereas the Mongolians would use a smaller recurve bow that was better for the open field skirmishing that they were typically engaged in, because Mongolia is predominantly just flat terrain. There are mountains, and well, there are a few mountains. There are mostly hills, but predominantly the region is relatively flat. So there was no need for bows that would send missiles at tremendous distances through arcs and the like. You were usually not too far from the target you were fighting. So the smaller recurve bow with a easier to manage size, which was better for the type of horseback archery they engaged in, fired their projectile faster than the traditional Japanese longbow, which is about the height I am very tall. I am 6 feet tall. The traditional Japanese longbow is about the same height as I am. And the reason it is so large is because it is designed to be fired from horseback. And it can fire in those arcs. And it is designed not only for direct fire, but for the siege arc that you would usually ascribe to the English longbow. I believe we're all familiar with the English longbow and the bodkin arrow. The Japanese longbow is capable of firing in a similar manner, at a large ballistic arc, but it is also more than capable of firing in a direct line to whatever your target may be. And all of this is from horseback. Swords, short swords, like the wakizashi, the smaller dagger, which is referred to as the kaiken, those became not so much that those were not the primary weapon, those were more your weapon of last resort. Now, this was something that was again taught to all of the bushi, both before they started and then when they became a full class of people. And the female members of this warrior aristocracy, the bushi, and then the families that were above them, those that became the daimyo, women in these families were often taught these things. They were capable of defending themselves. But the weapon most often associated with the Onna-Bugeisha is what is referred to as the naginata, which you may be unfamiliar with the name, but I assure you, you have seen the weapon. The naginata is the curved polearm, the halberd-esque polearm that you've seen. If you've seen any anime or read a manga or any of those late night Kurosawa films, which we all know those, the black and white samurai movies, you have seen a naginata. It is the spear shaft with a blade that goes up and then tapers and curves back. This is often thought of as the traditional weapon of the Onna-Bugeisha. It is designed for fighting cavalry because one must remember the bushi, the samurai, started out as mounted archers. Well, if one does not have a bow, it is possible to take down a mounted warrior with a sword, but someone on a horse has far more reach than you do. So, what does one do to deal with that? What one does is they have a longer weapon. That is where the naginata, the yari as well, came in. The yari is the traditional Japanese spear. You are likely familiar with this because this was the weapon that was often given to what are referred to as ashikaru, the conscript warrior, the peasant warrior. When armies needed to fill their ranks, they would grab peasants, they would press them into service, give them maybe, if they were fortunate, a chest plate, a spear, and say, walk forward until you cannot walk forward anymore. And while you're walking forward, if there's things to stab, go for it. Do what feels right. So, the Yari is a very easy to master weapon. Well, easy to use weapon, not easy to master. It's a very easy to use weapon. It is a stick with a pointy end on it. The Naginata, however, is, well, capable of being a thrusting weapon, is a far more difficult weapon to use because of its size and the shape of the blade. It is designed to take down cavalry, and yet it also works well not simply on an open field, but it was designed to be used in such a way that it gave a defender the advantage in the confined hallways of a castle. Japanese castles are designed to be small and well, the interiors are designed to be small and easy to defend. The naginata is exceptionally useful for this. Alongside the what was generally a basic martial training was a rather in-depth education in literacy, what we would refer to previously as rhetoric, which is the ability to actually hold a conversation, which is now called public speaking, but it is essentially the same thing. Calligraphy, and well, yes, I am sure some of you here have seen movies like Hero with Jet Li or other Wire Fu or those, again, Kurosawa films where they have the stylization of, oh, calligraphy equals swordsmanship because the strokes of the brush are the slashes of the sword. While there is some overlap, not so much in those particular movements, but in judicious movement at period, not simply I can move the brush around, the brush moves the same way my sword does, but I know where to move the brush and how much to move it. Translates into I know where to move the sword and how much to move it. Self control, discipline, these are the things that translate betwixt the two, which is why calligraphy is often part of, in at least in the East, the training of whatever warrior classes there may be. This was referred to as pen and sword education. A Onna-Bugeisha, just like her bushi brothers, was trained to wield a sword as well as she could wield her mind. Confucian classics, rhetoric, as we said, which this all goes into a basic literacy, calligraphy, which compounds that literacy but also teaches discipline and self control, an understanding of current events, how to manage households. Because the thing that is almost unique to Japan is that traditionally women are the ones that, when I say run the household, I do mean run the household. While the while the husband or the whatever may go and earn their wages and make the money in and of itself, the finances, the management of resources within the home, those are the purview of the woman. And this is a traditionally Japanese thing. And because of this understanding of finance and management, this stems from that kind of training well, not training, rather the education that Onna-Bugeisha would receive. And this did, to an extent, trickle down to families in lower classes because it has always been the women will literally run the household. Not in the Western sense where it's just, oh, the woman cooks and the woman cleans and takes care of the children. No, the household is hers. This is our domain. We manage it. You are a part of it. But we have a history of the Onna-Bugeisha from, again, this is going into the legendary area because we're referring to Empress Jingū of possibly 712 CE or the Common Era up until almost 1870. That is over 1,000 years of history for a group that If you are not one that watches much anime or anything, you've probably never even heard of. Today, what we will do, though, is we will go over some of the more well known. We've already started with Empress Jingū in our introduction today. She is said to have been, well, she first came onto the scene in the earliest recordings, again in 1712 CE. What we will do now is we will speak of probably the most famous of all Onna-Bugeisha, and you do not need to be a Japanese historian or history buff or anything to have heard of this woman. Her legend is known throughout the world. You may not know much of her, but I can almost assure you've heard her name. Onna Gozen. Now, that is not actually her name. Her last name is Gozen. But Tomoe is basically an honorific. It means noble lady or honorable lady. So she is Lady Gozen. That is what she is known to history as. Tomoe Gozen, or Lady Gozen, had fought in the Genpei War. The Genpei War went from 1180 CE to 1185 CE. Again, the most famous of all Onna-Bugeisha. I would be surprised if more of you have not heard of her than have, because again, she is so well known, so ubiquitous when you think of the archetype of the female samurai. Now, unfortunately, most of what we have regarding her is conjecture with a bit of epic storytelling. A lot of what we hear of her is from the tale of Ike, which is a literary work that was composed many years after the Genpei War. Which the Genpei War, for those that are unaware, is between two of the largest bushi clans. So to understand what this is and where these all came from, we do need to sidetrack just a little to where did the samurai come from? During the earliest days of Japan, the emperors would raise conscript armies. Now, within these conscript armies, the idea was quantity. So many guys you win through purely attrition. There is a tidal wave of bodies that you drop upon your enemy. And of course, with that, you will win eventually. Eventually, you will win the day. However, within these conscript armies, which conscript armies are expensive to maintain, there was some attempts for this army to be able to manage itself and to take some of its own provisioning burden upon itself. While the armies were formed and were in use during harvesting and planting seasons, they would be expected to, as I said, plant and harvest. They were expected to be able to grow their own food to help supply themselves to offset the cost to the imperial treasury. But one cannot simply use a conscript army and hope to get anywhere with it, especially prior to the introduction of firearms. Because the utilization of something like a bow requires not a lot to learn to use, but to use effectively in a master is a lifetime commitment. And contrary to what video games like to tell you, the bow is not a dexterity weapon. The bow is a strength weapon. If you have ever tried to pull a bow, You know exactly what I am talking about. The bow is not a dexterity weapon by any stretch of the imagination. You have to be very strong to be able to pull the bow. Well, the Imperial House had what were the makings of the samurai, the bushi class, the proto-bushi. Proto meaning the early or pre-bushi, before what these groups were. They were middling to somewhat lesser, some were a little higher nobility, not quite related to the imperial family, but they were noble families. They would, and if you've watched any of my streams regarding the game that we are doing the current playthrough of, Triangle Strategy, when you have additional heirs, we've all heard the term the heir and then a spare. Well, with your spares, you want to have them be useful. You want them to be able to serve a purpose because idle hands are going to find their way around an older sibling's throat. Because that inheritance of a kingdom or inheritance of land is looking really good, and that neck is very easy to squeeze. So, the additional siblings, the additional heirs, are often given more martial training. This gave them a use. They could now serve in a military capacity, which the military was, and to an extent still is, thought of as a good and, you know, meaningful way to advance your career throughout whatever it is you wish to do. Now, these families, these noble families, would have their additional heirs go and become kind of like an officer corps of sorts. They were not the samurai yet, they were the makings of it. Because at the same time, a lot of these noble families that were cropping up did have ties directly to the imperial family. Some of them, in fact, were actually directly related to the emperor. The emperor may have a wife and then various consorts down the line. And a heir that maybe two, three, four members down the line, well, this this guy is not going to inherit. Obviously, he's far too far down the line. There's just no way. What do we do with him? He is sent off to form his own family. And these families were referred to as Minamoto and Taira. Now, there were different groups, different subsets within the Minamoto clans and the Taira clans. And each of them was given different things to do. So there would be some Minamoto who could trace their ancestry back to a particular emperor. They would generally band together to become the some region or their Minamoto, or the Minamoto of a particular emperor. They would usually take that emperor's name. Just for ease of use, let's just say that there was a group that could tie their ancestry back to Emperor Ojin. Well, they'd be the Ojin Minamoto. Or let us say there was a tyrant group that could do the same. They'd be the Oja tyrant. So these groups were loosely affiliated, mostly because they were all more or less family cousins, several generations removed, but they were all related through the imperial household. And as I said, these different clans did different things. The Minamoto generally were in the northern parts of Japan, helping suppress various uprisings of rebel groups, or the tribes up north that were independent and fighting against the expansion of the empire. Because this is well before Japan was a unified country. Japan was regions that were ruled by different groups, and each of these groups often did not want to give up what they felt they had for any sort of hegemony under an empire or under an emperor. Well, the Minamoto would see to that. And, the Taira were usually in the southern parts of Japan. And the Taira, most famously, were pirate hunters. And they were very good at it and became very wealthy from it because how does one, before any kind of shipping manifesting or the way to properly manage, log, catalog, and track anything, how does one know what these stolen goods, who they belong to, where they came from? How do you return stolen property to its owner when there's no way to figure out who its owner may have been? And thus did the Taira have the authority by the imperial court to take into safekeeping the the things they liberated from the pirates. This allowed them to grow very wealthy very quickly. Well, these two clans and then the other smaller clans beneath them were the makings of the samurai. These groups became the samurai that you know of from whatever history you may know, from anime you've seen, movies, TV, manga you have read, books you may have read. This is where samurai come from. These warrior elite horseback archers that were where you would send your additional heirs so they had something to do without causing any sort of turmoil within your domain. Eventually, entire families thought, hey, this is a good thing. We can make money off of this. They became almost like mercenaries. And then they became a entrenched class set forth as nothing but warriors, which eventually morphed into the bushi class. Well, the Genpei War, circling back to where we were starting in the first place, the Genpei War was primarily fought between two groups. As we said, we have the Minamoto clan in the north of Japan and the Taira in the south of Japan. We could have an entire series of classes. We could spend a month easily discussing simply the Genpei War. But we will, in broad strokes, discuss what was occurring here. The two clans were fighting effectively for control of the emperor, or emperors at the time. There were two. There was the sitting emperor and then a retired emperor. Both wielded a considerable amount of political power. the two clans wanted to do was whomever had the emperor had Japan. In this, we find Lady Gozen, and I will read you an excerpt from the Heike Monogatari, which is, as I said before, the tale of Heike, which is a compilation of the Genpei War. This is an excerpt from it. I am not the one translating this. Tomoe was especially beautiful, with white skin, long hair, and charming features. She was also a remarkably strong archer. She was a swordswoman. She was a warrior worth 1,000, ready to confront a demon or a god, mounted or on foot. She had unbroken horses with superb skill. She rode unscathed down perilous descents whenever a battle was imminent. Yoshinaka sent her out as his first captain, equipped with strong armor, an oversized sword, and a mighty bow, and she performed more deeds of valor than any of his other warriors. Now, mind you, this is not technically a historical text in the sense of a properly cataloged history of what happened. This is a story. It is one of the few direct sources we have of this, but it is something like how we know of the Battle of Troy. We know of the Battle of Troy through the Odyssey. Yeah, the Iliad and the Odyssey are how we know of the Battle of Troy and all the subsequent things happening after. And those are not a historical record. Those are stories. Those are legends and tales. But these tales come from somewhere. And in all of these legends, there's a little bit of truth to it. However much truth there may be, who can say? But I believe it is safe to assume that some of this is relatively accurate. There may be some embellishment here and there, but I believe we can make the determination safely that Lady Gozen was a very beautiful, very talented Onna-Bugeisha, which is why she is the most well-known, the most famous, the most ubiquitous of all. That is why we all know of her. Now, we do have a actual official chronicle. Now, this was from a later shogunate. This is the Azuma Kagami. I'm going to read an excerpt from this. Again, I am not the one translating. In fact, I am not certain who translated this, but I'm also uncertain who translated the previous one either. So these are translations I had found in my research. I am not the one translating, but from the Azuma Kagami. This is discussing her defense of Torisaka Castle in the Ichigo province. And this is also probably the thing that when you think of Lady Gozen, more than likely picture. Hangaku let her hair down in a manner of a page boy, wore a breastplate, and stationed herself on the castle turret. The castle turret is the rampart, the raised up section of a rampart where you would generally use a bow, or if you had cannon, you would have cannon mounted there. She shot down every attacking warrior with arrows that never missed their mark, chest or head. She plotted strategies. Eventually, both of her legs were shot, of Fujisawa Yoshika. She was captured, sent to Kamakura, and presented to the shogun, Minamoto no Yurie. She remained thoroughly undaunted. Contemporary descriptions call her fearless as a man and beautiful as a flower. She was later ordered to marry a shogun retainer. This retainer was Asari Yoshito, and she reportedly bore a son. Now, this is the actual official record we have. This was from the Kamakura Shogunate, the Asuma Kugami record, which was their official record. It makes sense that they would have not executed her. Somebody so skilled, so not well thought of, because people, of course, knew Lady Gozen at the time, but somebody so useful, I suppose would be a good word for it, because you would always want to have somebody so capable on your side. And of course, if you have somebody like this, instead of executing them and making an enemy of those that would follow them, you keep them alive. You bring them into the fold. So, yes, having her marry one of his retainers, marry into his faction, and then bear a child for that retainer, that is a very shrewd political move. That does make sense. That is a thing that they would have done, and this does make sense. This does lend credence to later things we see, or rather earlier things we see, such as the excerpt we read from the Hike Monogatari. I do like the description. Fearless as a man and beautiful as a flower. That is so very elegant, and I love that. Now, there are other that would appear throughout history. Sadly, we do not have as many names as I would like. I would love to have been able to go over more of them between the time of Lady Gozen and where we eventually end our history here in the Ocean War, particularly the Aizu conflict within the Ocean War with the Jōshitai, or the Girls' Army. If you recall from our last lesson, we have Takeko Nanako. Oh, I apologize. Takeko Nakano. Sorry. Now, she was one of the most well documented of all Onna-Bugeisha, and this is a product of her time because the Ocean War, if you recall, was from 1868 to 1869. And we had observers from European nations here, as well as some Americans that were here. There were people here outside of the order of Japanese groups that were witness to this, that could chronicle these things. And because this is closer to the more modern era, the ability to record and chronicle these things was just overall better. So, yes, for Takeko Nakano, we have a lot of information. We do know that she was born in 1847 in Edo, and her family were samurai from the Aizu domain. As is common for the Onna-Bugeisha, she was trained in Nagana Jutsu, or the art of the Naginata. I will not bore you with the various styles and schools of Nagana Jutsu that she was trained in, because that is going to go off into things that we will be here for 3 days. We'll be discussing all of this and the various styles of various weapons. Suffice it to say, she was exceptionally skilled. She was also educated in the Tibetan classics and calligraphy, the pen and sword education, as we discussed it earlier in class. She had taught the Naginata to others and became a secretary and an instructor. Now, during the Boshin War, when Aizu was brought into the conflict, we have the siege of Wakamatsu Castle, which is, if you recall, where we saw the Jōshitai. Akano wanted to create an army to fight alongside the Gecko. She wanted to create an army. She wanted to fight alongside the Bakufu samurai. She was a loyalist to the Tokugawa. However, and this is why there's not a lot of historical, not evidence, documentation. There we go. There's not a lot of documentation of Onna-Bugeisha throughout history because it was not exactly frowned upon so much as, well, we will allow it in specific situations, and this was not one of them. If you were the wife of a head of a clan and your husband was killed in battle and you decided to take up the sword and the bow and join the battle to avenge your husband, to defend your family, that was acceptable. Yeah, no, that is fine. We like that. That is good. But if you were a woman and you simply wanted to pick up the weapon you were trained in to defend your home, no, we cannot allow that. It is silly, I know, but it was just the way of things at the time. So what Takeko ended up doing is she formed during this siege against the instructions of the defenders of the castle, the Jōshitai, or the girls' army. There's about 20 to 30 or so women in this. Her mother, who we have a record of her mother, Koko, and her sister, Yuko, who was 16 at the time, were also part of this group. Now, so there is a bit of context for age. I am not certain how old Koko was, her mother, but we do know Yuko was 16, and we do know that Takeko was 21. At 21, she formed her own army to defend her home from what she felt was, I mean, not felt, well, actually, no, no, I suppose felt, because depending on your point of view, this is either a rebellion or what the Bakufu is doing is a rebellion. Both sides saw the other as a rebellion against the order of things, the emperor's will, which may be a bit of mental gymnastics for the Bakufu, considering that with them, while they were traditionally the ones in charge and also theoretically operated by the mandate of the emperor, the other side was the emperor. So it kind of makes you think, well, maybe they were not exactly the guys not rebelling. They might have been the actual rebels themselves. This gets a bit explained away later on once Emperor Meiji took power, and shortly after, everybody was pardoned. Everyone was like, nope, we're just going to say nobody was doing this for any other reason than the best interest of the emperor and the country. Reasonable enough. It makes sense. And it was an important thing to do to heal the wounds that had manifested as a result of this very brutal civil war. So, with her army in tow, Takeko, her mother Koko, and her sister Yuko, on October 16th of 1868, moved to take the bridge of the Ugaki domain. The bridge was called Yanagi Bridge. Takeko led a charge against the Imperial troops. Now, at the time, the Imperial Army was armed with rifles. This was, to give you an understanding of this, Japan had had guns for centuries prior to this, but their guns were not rifles. You may be thinking, Professor, what is the fucking difference? What the fuck does a rifle? A rifle is just a long gun. Well, you were clearly not paying attention in our last class, because in our last class we discussed that a rifle, in the term you or most people use it, is not entirely correct. Rifle refers to the rifling or the spiral within the barrel of a gun. The rifles are longer guns with that spiraling in the barrel, but the spiraling is only one part of it. The other part is the invention of the conical bullet. The conical bullet was not even that old. One of the first places it was seen in being used in a major conflict was the American Civil War, which explains why it was so bloody. We're going to circle to that because that does help explain why the Boshin War was the way it was. The Civil War is often thought of as so bloody and so many casualties with all kinds of people thinking that, well, when you think of the Civil War and you think of people in hospitals, you think of those field hospitals with some battlefield surgeon with a hacksaw cutting off legs and feet and arms and whatnot. The reason being isn't because they just operating on primitive anything with trepanning being the next step or what have you. No, what they were doing is they were operating with what was the best medical technology at the time, dealing with the ability to kill somebody light years ahead of it. The conical bullet is far more accurate than the ball or what is called shot. Those little balls you see like in a musket, that is referred to as shot, not a bullet. A bullet is the conical thing that you see in guns now. Now, the bullet again is half the equation. The other half is the rifling. The bullet is accurate. The rifling makes all the things accurate. So a shot is now more accurate, regardless of what is coming out of it. Actual shot or a bullet is much more accurate because that rifling gives it a spin, which makes it where the wind resistance is dragging the round down a lot less. So it is able to go further and more accurately. when you add these two things together, the equation is complete, and you have a far, far more deadly tool of war than just the musket and ball. So, of course, when they were trying to deal with this, medical technology had nowhere near caught up to be able to manage the devastating results of this extremely accurate weapon. Well, Japan did not have rifling at the time. The rifling was invented later, but Japan, prior to this, had just been using the same design of the Tanagashima for centuries. A musket. There were improvements, yes, but it was still a musket. It still fired ball or shot. It was accurate enough. The closer you were, the more likely you were to hit the thing. But at distance, it was not as accurate. And honestly, you needed to fire volleys to ensure any casualties, really. However, the Boshin War, opening up trade to the West, introduced the first rifles, the first long guns with rifling and a actual conical bullet, which is why you have devastating firing lines, which is why the Imperial Army, which had so many more of them and so much more training, they might not have had as many soldiers overall as the Bakufu army did, but they were so much better trained and so much more accurate. They were able to inflict absolutely catastrophic casualties. Now, the Jōshitai were attacking Yanagi Bridge. Yanagi Bridge was defended by an Imperial detachment equipped with rifles. Again, actual rifles. Now, and this goes a bit to the, well, we are not going to fight women. Women do not get into combat. You do not fight women. This is going to play into this battle here. The commanders of the defending Imperial Army attached to the Yanagi Bridge instructed their men not to fire once they realized that the Jōshitai were all women. They eventually did start firing, but that hesitation gave the Jōshitai enough time to close the distance, and they inflicted devastating losses on the defenders there. They were able to kill about half of the defending army on that bridge, with Takeko herself being reported to have killed around 6, maybe 7, up some reports even say 10 people just with her naginata. Unfortunately, though, she did get around to the chest. And at this time, this was fatal. You were not going to just walk away from a bullet to the chest. This is a thing that modern technology, medical technology can deal with, but I know from personal experience about that. However, this was, you were going to die. So she was not going to make it. She asked her sister, and these are the official reports from this. She found Yuko and asked Yuko to take her head so that it could not be used as a trophy by the Imperial Army. Some reports say there was an Aizu soldier that helped. Others say it was Yuko herself. Regardless of who did what, Takeko was beheaded, and her head was taken to the family's temple, Bokaiji, and there it was buried under a pine tree. Her naginata was later donated to the temple, and actually there's a monument there to this day, not simply for her, but for all of the Aizu women that were part of the Jōshitai. that fought and died for what they believed in, fought and died defending their homes, their families, and what they saw as their country. Now, Takeko was not the last of the Onna-Bugeisha, but she is the last one thought of or often referred to as having died in combat. Because as you saw there, she was mortally wounded and then had her sister behead her so that she could not be taken prisoner. Now, there is one more that I would like to speak of here before we end class for the day. And this woman is Nishima Hiei. Now, she has a couple of nicknames, and this is why I like her so much. She is so neat. She was actually, unlike most of the Onna-Bugeisha at the time, she did not use a naginata. She was actually a sniper. She was a very skilled riflewoman, exceptionally skilled in firearms. So much so that she took on part of what her father did. Her father was a gunnery instructor. She did the same as well. She trained other women to use the new Western rifles. Now, she has a couple of names, or not names so much, a couple of nicknames. One of which is the Bakumatsu Joan of Arc, but my favorite is the Nightingale of Japan. Now, this one I like because once she survived the defensive Aizu in the Boshin War, she became a nurse. She eventually married a Christian missionary and became a nurse with the Japanese Red Cross. She served as a nurse during the First Sino-Japanese War and then later the Japanese-Russo War, which is where she gets the term, or the nickname, the Nightingale of Japan. Another very neat thing about her is she was the first woman outside of the imperial family to be decorated by the modern Japanese government for the services she rendered. She received the Order of the Precious Crown, not simply once, but twice. And for those, hopefully all of you are aware of what I mean by this, the Nightingale of Japan. This is a reference to Florence Nightingale. And with that, that is the bell. I will see everyone for our next class. Do not forget to study the material that we went over here today. I hope all of you took notes. There will be a quiz. Have a wonderful rest of your day.